I'm Jonathan Miles. Is alcohol ever an excuse for bad behaviour? Well, I spoke to a lawyer friend of mine this morning, Claire, and she said there's no defence, basically. If you plead guilty, then it can be a mitigating circumstance that you were less capable because of the alcohol. Martin is a recovering alcoholic. Is that how I describe you, Martin?
Yeah, that's completely fine.
All right. Ever an excuse for bad behaviour?
It's such an interesting question. I mean, I'm not an active member of Alcoholics Anonymous, although I have used some of their steps before. And one of the steps is to make a list of all the persons that we've harmed and become willing to make amends to them, and then made direct amendments, except for where it would injure them to do so. So you are asked, in recovering from alcoholism, to take responsibility for the things that you've done. I mean, whether or not you were drunk, it doesn't take away your responsibility. And I understand how it can be a mitigating circumstance. You could say, I wouldn't have done it if I wasn't drunk. And you have to remember that your judgment is impaired, your inhibitions are lowered, but you are still responsible at the end of the day.
I mean, in some respects, I can't see how you are responsible. I mean, I've just got an email from my friend who's a barrister, and she says, if you plead not guilty and run the matter to trial, voluntary intoxication cannot be used as a defence in isolation. If, however, you plead guilty and accept being voluntarily intoxicated, then your legal representative can mitigate the offence itself on your behalf, but only to a very narrow extent.
Yeah.
You can see how it's not your fault. I did some stuff in Dubai, and I don't remember it. I really, really don't. But was it my fault because the alcohol had an effect on my body?
I think you might have chosen the wrong place to get very drunk in.
Yeah, I know. Well, but you could there, I'm afraid. We drank enough in that country to float the Titanic.
It's very interesting. It's the whole dichotomy of alcohol. I mean, we have a drinking culture, and we're a society that drinks, yet drinking is our society's biggest problem.
I wonder, Martin, you were, dare I say, a drunk for a while, weren't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
How long?
Very heavily for about 7 years. I was quite lucky to stop drinking when I was fairly young.
If you get drunk and say something, is that your innermost person talking, or is it just the booze?
It's the innermost person starting to come out, but I mean, you don't necessarily want to. You don't necessarily actually mean the thing that you say directly. I mean, if you're talking short-term effects, yeah, when you're just drunk on a single day, it does lower your inhibitions and affects your judgment and all that sort of stuff. But over the long term, it really does affect who you are as a person, and you end up with so much rage at yourself and at the alcohol and at life and everything. It just bursts out of you. But,
I mean, you can talk about this from first-hand experience. Why do we have different opinions when it comes to being drunk? If our friends are a bit loud and a bit rude, we think it's funny.
Yeah.
But if they hit someone, it's suddenly not funny and alcohol is blamed.
Yeah. There are certain lines that you think you shouldn't ever cross. And, everyone's perception of what is a joke and what isn't is different, and it's all individually judged, but it's because we all want to use alcohol to have fun, and it often doesn't end up that way on a night out.
I mean, if you did something bad when you were drunk and apologise, should people forgive you?
To some extent. I do truly think that it is a slightly mitigating factor. Obviously, I have a slightly warped opinion on this, given my history, but I do believe it is a slightly mitigating factor, not massively. But if responsibility is taken away from the action or whatever it was that you did, then that responsibility then has to be placed upon your drinking. And you have to say, actually, I am a problem drinker because I got that drunk in the first place, because after all, only problem drinkers get drunk.
You see, there are 3 cases in the paper today. We'll exclude the first one we mentioned, which is the Dennis Waterman thing. Taking the Twitter abuse case,
yes.
There's a student who is apparently, beyond being comforted at the moment because he realises what he said. He was drunk. And he said, but the thing is, had he been sober rather than drunk, would it have been worse? Because he's abused this footballer who's in hospital, you see.
Yes, yeah. I think so. I mean, it's so easy to say, oh, he was drunk, it was fine, or, oh, he was sober, that's a terrible thing to have done. But I do think it would have been worse if he was sober. I mean, there's also other things to take into account. I mean, it's quite a young guy, I think he's sort of 21, and posting on Twitter, I mean, you sometimes lose sense of reality. I don't want to make any excuses for him. I don't know the guy or the case particularly, aside from what I've read in the papers. But it's hard to realise you're actually speaking about real people, or that you're having an effect in reality if you're just posting a little blurb online. But I do think it is a worse thing to say if you're sober. But it's still not great.
Well, I suppose you've got. Yeah, I mean, I suppose, Martin, you've got no defence if you're sober.
Yes,
you know, and that would the things that you were saying would mean you really meant them. When you're on alcohol or when you're on drugs, there is a vague, thin veil of defence, as in you weren't totally compos mentis. If you get really drunk, but by good fortune don't come across anybody on the way home from the pub to hit, so nothing happens. That's okay. Well,
that's giving free license to drink, which we all have. That's the society we live in. But the problem is that when you decide to get drunk, this isn't always the case if you're an alcoholic, say, and you're drunk all the time. But most people are sober when they choose to get drunk. So they had control, and then they made their choice.
See, Mo in Tynemouth makes a good point. The old saying, "What's in you when sober comes out when you're drunk."
Yeah, absolutely.
You're still putting yourself in that situation where you might lose control and something terrible could happen. Should there be tougher punishments for just being drunk, do you think?
Not necessarily punishments in the traditional sense, but help. I mean, we need more help to recognise when we have a drinking problem, when we're alcoholics, how we can help ourselves. And we do that with discourse. I mean, I write about alcoholism to try and help people recognise what it is to be an alcoholic, and try and help families who have lost alcoholics come to terms with their loss, because not a lot of people understand exactly what's happening or why we're drinking. So the more we can help people recognise why they're using alcohol, why they're self-medicating with it, or what they need it for, the more we can stop people drinking. It's not just a question of punishing our actions when we're drunk, but helping people not need to drink in the first place.
Thank you very much. Martin is a recovering alcoholic.